Hello folks, and welcome to my Vanguard Saga of Heroes classes overview video. I first put out, my last video was a Dread Knight, or class video for the Dread Knight, but after a little bit of thinking I kind of figured that it would be better for me to do sort of an overview video first before breaking down into all the other classes and making videos for all those, just so that I could sort of touch on each class first to give everybody a general idea of all of them, and then, you know, get it really into the details of each one later in their individual videos. So since this is an overview video, there's going to be no gameplay. I'm basically just going to be talking for a little while. So if you're looking for gameplay, this is not the video you want to watch. I have a couple videos up already, and I will be doing a video specifically for each class whenever I get around to getting all of them done. There are 15 classes, so it's probably going to take a little while. But those will be far more detailed, and they will have gameplay in them. But this one will not. This one is going to be pretty high level, not too detailed for each class, because there are a lot of them and I don't want this video to take forever for people to watch and be too long. So I'm going to keep it pretty general, and try not to spend too much time on each one of them, but hopefully I can give everybody the basic gist of each class to help maybe help people maybe make a decision or decide between two different classes, or, you know, just learn more about the classes to get better informed. So yes, I guess we'll just go ahead and go down the list here, starting with the protective fighters at the top. As you can see, there are three different kinds. There's the warrior, the paladin, and the dread knight. These are the tanks, being protective fighters. They all perform the same role equally well. Unlike a lot of other games, I can think back to original EQ, where warriors were really the tanks, and then paladins and shadow knights in EQ were kind of off-tank roles. They were like legitimately lesser tanks for a long time. They could still tank pretty well, but they didn't have all the tools, and when you were talking about raid tanking, it was always a warrior, because warriors had defensive, you know, discipline and all that stuff. In this game, all three tanks can do the core job equally well. They can all mitigate damage the same, and they can all generate aggro very well, which of course is the two main points of tanking. The difference between the three is really the approach and the flavor they bring to the role. The three here, the warrior is really the most straightforward, sort of. It's exactly what it sounds like. It's a combatant of brute force, just like it says right there. They don't have any spells or anything like that. They have some sort of combat style buffs, which they call like shouts or commands, that they give their group to empower them for a short period of time, usually like 8, 12, 15 seconds, something like that. But they don't actually have any spells or long-term buffs or anything like that. And they don't, there's really nothing, there's nothing too complex about the way they approach their fight and they generate their aggro. I personally find the warrior the most fun to play, though. They're very active. They don't, you know, there's not a whole lot, and you're constantly just really using your abilities, and their playstyle is very active to hold aggro. But they're, you know, very straightforward and melee, and, you know, they just beat the crap out of stuff. A lot of fun. That's actually my main class as a warrior, and I enjoy it greatly. The paladin is actually pretty straightforward in the general paladin idea in a lot of games. They're pretty defensive in nature, defenders of the weak and punishers of the wicked and all that sort of stereotypical stuff. It's really well implemented in this game, but the idea behind it is pretty standard. You know, they use a sword and a shield. They have kind of holy power. They get heals and they get buffs. They get invulnerabilities that they can cast both on themselves and their groups. They have extra abilities versus undead, but they're very tough. They're very defensive in nature. They don't have a whole lot of debuffs per se. They have a few, and they in general do the least amount of damage of the 3 tanks. If you're looking for a tank that can dish out some damage, Paladin in general is not the one you want to choose because of how defensively oriented they are. But they make great tanks. They can hold aggro really well. The damage output is not quite there compared to the warrior, which is the highest of the 3. The warriors don't get any invulns or anything, or heals or anything like that, but they in general will do a lot more damage than the other 2. The Dread Knight is kind of in between the warrior and the paladin in the offensive defensive spectrum, but they're sort of the caster tank, if you will. They don't really have any buffs or heals like the paladin does, but they have several debuffs they can put on whatever they're fighting, as well as Dreadful Countenance, which is the built-in debuff that is built into their class, where the longer they're in combat with a monster, the more debuffed the monster becomes. It takes more damage, it does less damage, its resists are lowered, all kinds of stuff like that. The Dread Knight has fear. They can fear kite. They don't have any heals for other people, but they have multiple life taps they can use to heal themselves. Kind of like it's like a necro / tank, if you think of a sort of a standard necromancer with their life taps and stuff like that. They're kind of the necro tank, a lot like a Shadow Knight was in EverQuest. They tend to use big 2-handed weapons. Paladin uses, sword and shield, and the warrior tends to dual wield. Just to kind of give you the flavor of how they approach the same fight. The Dread Knight will debuff the mob and do a lot of damage. Pretty well split between spell damage, nukes and dots, and swinging their axe at the mob. Paladins have a few nukes, kind of like holy nukes in nature, but they more or less just hit stuff with their hammer and shield and are very defensive. They don't do a whole lot of damage, whereas a warrior is just kind of all out, I'm gonna beat the crap out of you and kill you before you kill me, because the warrior has no way of healing himself or herself. The warrior has no way of healing itself, whereas the other 2 tanks do. This is the reason the warrior is the worst solo class in the game. They can solo, but you have to pick your battles really well, because you have to be able to kill the monster before it kills you. And if that is not the case, you are going to die, unless you manage to run away and survive. But yeah, all 3 tanks do a really good job at the tanking role. They can all hold aggro really well, and they can all take damage really well. The Paladin has more defensive tools, like invulns and stuff, and heals. The Dread Knight has 1 invuln, and the Warrior has none, but the damage output scale is kind of in reverse. Paladin's the lowest, Dread Knight is next highest in general, and Warrior is definitely the most damage of all the tanks. But personally, in my personal opinion, I really like playing the Warriors. That you can't really solo with them, but they're amazing in groups, and I think they're just more fun to play. So for the offensive fighters, which is basically your melee DPS, because your casters are down here. So the offensive fighters are the ranger, the rogue, the monk, and the bard. All of these are pretty standard classes when it comes to fantasy MMOs. They were all in EverQuest and a lot of similar games. In this game, the ranger it's not totally a ranged class. It's not like a WoW hunter necessarily. I haven't played WoW in forever, but I know that hunters were almost entirely ranged and they didn't melee at all. Last I knew. The ranger in this game is not quite the same, where they can definitely use their bow, and they have lots of bow attacks and ranged attacks, but they also dual wield weapons, and they're not afraid to get into melee combat. More like a ranger from like a Lord of the Rings style ranger than anything else. They have lots of nice combo attacks for both melee and ranged. They can put together different bow shots for different effects, and different melee attacks and special orders for different effects and extra abilities. And they're really overall a really solid DPS class. They're one of the highest DPS classes. I regularly see one of our rangers, in a raid, parsing at the top, or very close to. But it's basically your standard approach to ranger. They get, snares. They have a few minor buffs. They have one sort of small heal over time, which is, you're not going to be main healing anything, but they do have a small heal that they can use. But then they can snare, and they can bow kite if they're going to solo, or they can jump into melee stance if they're in a good group and really go to town with their weapons. It's good stuff. Ranger is a lot of fun for a lot of people. The rogue class is a little less versatile than the ranger. Rogues are the definitive melee DPS class. They get behind a mob, they get stealthed in behind a mob and just go to town with stabbing them with daggers. Pretty standard rogue stuff. But all other things being equal, rogues will top the DPS charts compared to all the other offensive fighters. If the tank can hold aggro off them, which they should be able to, rogues are really good at not pulling aggro compared to a lot of other classes. They can really just hammer out the damage. Lots of, shank and shiv, and they have lots of melee dots and bleeds they can put on the mob and all sorts of stuff like that. They really are the the pinnacle of melee DPS, more or less. But nothing too crazy or out of the ordinary about the rogue. Really good class, especially if you're one who just looks for the DPS role. They are probably the second worst soloers in the game, just because, again, the whole class is designed to being behind the mob and not getting hit to do their job, more or less. And if they're going to solo, then they don't have anyone to hold attention off of them, which makes things a little harder. They can do it, easier than a warrior can even, but they're kind of a close second in the race for worst soloing class in the game. Monks are pretty much exactly what you would think. It's very similar to the monks in other games. Very well done. They're kind of the toughest of the melee offensive fighters. They use martial weapons, and they can use wind blades, which give them innate parry bonuses and things like that. And they also get lots of abilities which increase their mitigation and give them dodge chance. Like Read in the Wind is an ability they get, which lets them dodge 50% of everything for like a long time. And then on top of that, they're also very good at dealing damage. Monks are a little bit more bursty in terms of their damage output. They kind of burst, they unload a big chunk of damage, and then they have to sort of wait for some cooldowns on their big abilities. But overall, their damage output is very high. They can rank right up there with rangers and rogues and other classes, especially if the fight's relatively short, because they can burst really hard within that short period, and it fits really well with short classes, and they'll be way up there near the top. And then if a fight's long enough where they can burst again when all their stuff comes off cooldown, then it's even better. Monks and disciples actually have a special resource called Jin, which they can use in addition to endurance, and in the disciples' case, energy as well, to fuel some of their abilities, which is pretty nice. Monks also, of course, get feign death, like many monks in other games, and they can actually solo pretty well because they have a self-heal, and then of course they can feign death to keep from dying. And they're just naturally the tankiest of the offensive fighters, but quite good to play. They can tank for groups in many situations, until you get the stuff that really hits hard and the higher level stuff. But they can tank really well. They do a lot of damage, and they're actually pretty fun to play. You can take a monk in two directions. You can take them either dragon style or drunken style. It says here that there's a harmonious path as well, but that's not true anymore. That the harmonious path was just added into the monk in general. So really, it's a choice between dragon style or drunken style. And drunken is really the better style for late game, because I'm a raider. So once you get up to like level 50 and above, drunken is definitely better because they're both tougher and they do more damage. But for leveling up, I don't really think there's a huge preference one or the other. Drunken is a little bit more burst damage, and then Dragon is a little bit more sustained, and I think they have an extra AoE attack and some other stuff. But they're both pretty good for leveling up, and they can both do the job just fine. But at higher level, Drunken is a little bit better for monks. The Bard is probably the best Bard class I've ever seen in an MMO for the implementation. If you ever played or knew a Bard in original EverQuest, this Bard is pretty similar in terms of the way it is. It's kind of the jack of all trades class, and of the offensive fighters, it's the one that is least focused on their melee damage. They can compose their own songs, which, unlike EverQuest where they twisted songs together element by element, they really just take song components and put them together in a pre-composed song that they can save to do whatever they want. You know, some components are regen, hit point or energy regen, invisibility, run speed, damage song for the group. They have offensive, they can snare, and they can sing dot songs, and all sorts of components that they can mix and match and put together in whatever song, and then they can save it, and then they just click a button and start playing that song, and it just pops up in the buff bar and provides whatever they put into it to the group or themselves. And then they can make multiple songs and to fit the different situations and just switch back and forth. It's really a good way to do it for bards. But then, because of their songs and their other abilities, they get pretty much all the forms of CC as they level up. They can fear, and they can charm, and they can lull, and they can mez. They're very versatile. They're by far the most versatile of the offensive fighters, and a little bit more supporty. They do less personal DPS than the other offensive fighters by quite a margin, but they kind of make up for it with the DPS boost they provide whatever group they're in, because of their damage songs and abilities that they can bring. They increase the group's damage significantly, which sort of offsets their slightly lesser damage compared to the other offensive fighters. Really fun class to play. I also have a max level Bard as basically my second character, and I love him. It's so much fun to play a Bard. And it's not like they're a slouch in terms of damage. They can do really good damage themselves in addition to what they bring to a group. It's just not quite at the level of the other three, that's all. Let's see, so the healers. There are 4 healers, of course. The cleric is, people are used to seeing a cleric in MMOs. There's not too much different. It's a little bit different than clerics in many other games, but the overall approach to the cleric is similar. The shaman it's kind of the same thing. There were shamans in EverQuest and shamans in WoW, and the sort of the overall idea of kind of the totem, spiritual healer that does totems and kind of stuff like that it's sort of still there, but the implementation is a bit different, and I think very unique and very awesome in Vanguard. And then the 2 sort of Vanguard unique healers, which are the Disciple and the Blood Mage. Blood Mage is probably the most unique class in MMOs ever, because I don't think I've seen a class like the Blood Mage anywhere else at all. Disciple, I think it's an amazing class and definitely very unique, but the concept of it is a little more thought of. But going back and starting from the left side, the cleric is kind of your standard cleric. It's a plate-wearing healer with, their heals come from their holy divine powers, just like a paladin. But in Vanguard, clerics are, it's kind of more of a battle cleric than the old stand back and just cast heals cleric. Um, they obviously have a wide array of healing which they can do. They have a heal over time, they have a big heal, they have a quick heal, they have an instant heal. At level 50 they get a really big burst heal that they can only use on the same target like once every 6 seconds or something. And they have an AoE heal and all shields they can get, and all sorts of healing and support abilities that they have. But they're also, they have several combat buffs they can put up, which are melee attacks. So they can get up and actually take their hammers and start hitting the mobs, and they can heal the group that way. They get an ability which they can just turn on, which every time they hit a monster they heal their group for a small amount. So they can actually heal the group by damaging, by meleeing the mob. It's not a huge amount of healing, but it's pretty nice. And then they have several combat buffs. They have a melee chain which they can open up and use on a mob, which will increase the group's damage by 10% for 5 minutes. Which is awesome. That's a great buff. So that they're not the kind to just sort of sit back and heal unless the situation demands it. And they also, they're basically the battle cleric. They can get up. They have a melee attack to help restore their mana, because they probably are the most mana intensive of the healers, which encourages them to really wade in and get in there and use their melee attacks to help them keep their mana up and to heal with. But they're very tough. They have the best of the healers. They have the best single target burst healing. They have 2 instant heals they can use on the tank or whoever, and they can easily heal for the most hit points in one shot of all the healers. Great for healing through big spiky damage on tank or whoever, and for helping shield from incoming damage. They can, at level 20, clerics can choose an affinity, which is a nice way to sort of diversify. They can choose between preservation, purity, war, peace, and death. The most popular of them, those are preservation, peace, and war. Preservation, of course, gives them some extra, but each affinity gives a few extra abilities and stuff like that, and some give an extra stance. But preservation is mainly about healing and protection, as you would guess from the name. War gives them extra DPS chains and lets them do more damage, which is pretty cool for soloing. Peace makes them really good at controlling aggression. They can give people an aggro buff, which makes DPS generate less aggro. They can drop their own aggro. They can drop out of combat. They get both regular invisibility and invisibility to undead. Really cool stuff like that. Purity and death are not really used quite as much, but they're sort of the anti-undead and caster versions of the cleric. The shaman, unlike the clerics, they don't really have the same array of heals that the clerics do. They don't have a heal over time for other people, as far as I remember. I don't think they do. They do have one for themselves, which they can put up, called Bosworth's Gift, but it's self-only, and it basically allows them to keep themselves topped off without having to focus on themselves for healing, and they can just watch everybody else, which is really nice. But they're probably the best group healer in terms of like actual group heals that hit everyone at once. All the healers can heal a group just fine, that's not what I meant, but they actually have several group heals that will just heal everyone. But they also have a lot of their heals come with like reactive heals and shields, so you can throw a heal on the group, and then for the next 6 times anyone gets hit, they also get healed additionally by the spell you put on them, like a reactive heal. So you can heal them, and then the next time they get hit, they'll get healed for another 500 or something automatically for the next several times they get hit, which is a pretty cool effect. Several of their heals also add shields, so you'll heal them, and then that same heal effect will also absorb an amount of damage that they take in the near future, so that you don't have to heal again right away necessarily. It's actually a really nice mechanic. But then in addition to that, Shaman can actually DPS pretty well for a healer, much more so than a cleric. They get to choose between 3 different patron spirits. They can go bear, which is Turgan. They can go wolf, which is Rakur, and they can go phoenix, which is Heatet. The bear shaman tends to be more tanky. They get a bear pet, which can tank for them. The bear pet can force taunt, and they get a lot of nice melee buffs. And they get very tough for a shaman, and they can sort of tank really well. All the shaman can heal well, but it's kind of like the flavors. They just bring different flavors to the fight. All the shaman can heal, but the bear is much more tanky and can kind of gear more into strength and stuff like that. The Rakur shaman, the wolf shaman, is more like a melee DPS shaman. They summon a wolf pet. They get a lot of big DPS abilities that they can use. They get a stealth, which they can utilize, and they probably do the most DPS and can level the fastest if they're soloing because of the damage they can do. Phoenix shaman is kind of the spellcaster shaman. They hang back and they get a bunch of nukes for being a phoenix shaman, and a phoenix pet and various fire AoEs and things like that, and energy regen buffs, which is really nice. But overall, really good group healer, probably the most versatile of all the healers. They can really fit any situation for whatever type of healing is needed. They have several big heals. They don't have as many instant heals as a cleric, especially single target ones, but they can heal very well, and they can they have the most group healing abilities. The Disciple is probably one of the signature classes of Vanguard. The Disciple is the monk style healer. They're very much like a monk. They use martial weapons and bladed staves and stuff like that. The biggest advantage to them is that they can feign death as a healer, which is amazing. They do a very decent amount of damage through their melee attacks, because they basically heal through attacking in melee. They get an ability called Inner Light, which will automatically heal the group every time you hit the mob, which you can toggle on and off. And so basically, just by DPSing the mob, they can heal their group, which is amazing. It also makes them by far the best soloer in the game, because they can heal themselves while they're soloing without actually having to worry about healing, because it just happens passively, and they can focus on killing a monster and then they heal themselves at the same time. They also have a lot of melee triggered heals. They get like Endowment of Life, which you do 3 abilities in a certain order, and it procs a heal basically without you actually having to cast one, which is it's incredibly useful. Like monks, they can use Jinn, so they have both melee heals, which use their endurance. They have casted heals, which they don't often use but can, that are fed from energy, that cost energy. They also have Jinn heals, which cost Jinn, and one of them is instant and one of them is a big heal over time. So they're incredibly versatile, although they are a bit gimped if they can't hit the monster. If they have to stand back and heal from a distance, like a cleric or a shaman or a blood mage, they have a little bit of trouble because they naturally have less energy and they don't really like using energy heals. But they are easily one of the coolest classes I think ever, and by far the best soloers. They don't really have huge heals like a cleric does. A cleric can pop a really, really big heal on a tank. A Disciple doesn't really heal that way. The way they approach it is more smaller heals, but much faster. Inner Light will heal every time they hit the mob, which can be pretty fast. Their Endowment of Life they can trigger pretty quickly. They use Kiss of Heaven, which is their Jinn heal over time. Their Jinn instant heal is not huge, but is an instant heal. They basically just provide a lot of small heals very quickly, which is really good for healing in situations where you're not having huge spike damage, but you kind of have a lot of AoEs flying around a little bit, and they can just heal the group all at once with heals over time and sort of small quick heals. Very, very capable group healers. All the healers are incredibly capable group healers and amazing soloers, but they kind of each have their strengths for specific situations, and the disciple group healing strength is for sort of small but consistent damage that happens quickly, and then they can keep up with it. Whereas a cleric would have real trouble keeping up with healing everyone in that kind of situation, because they would heal one person really big with a really big heal, and they would kind of have to keep switching people and healing individually instead of AoE. The Blood Mage is probably the most unique class in Vanguard, the most unique healer class. They're not really a mix of any classes. They are, as the name suggests, a healer that utilizes life taps and things like that in order to heal, and gifts of blood and things like that. That's the lore, is the Blood Mage. They can take blood, they use their own blood to heal people, they can take blood from a monster and things like that. They manipulate blood. But what that basically translates to gameplay wise is, well, like I said, life taps is the big one. They basically can gear like a nuker. They don't have to worry too much about gearing like a healer, and they can just life tap the mob, because they can nuke a mob with a life tap and then transfer the hit points the damage they did to their defensive target as a heal. So they don't life tap to themselves necessarily, although they can do that, but they can life tap from their offensive target that you're trying to kill and use it to heal the tank, it's a really unique way of doing it. And then their group heal is the same. It's actually a chain that they open up whenever they crit on a spell, and then it's an instant cast, just boom, they hit blood tribute, and basically the whole group is full health again, because it's a really big group heal that's basically a life tap nuke. So it's really, really unique, and they have an ability which, because they often drain their own health, one of their stances drains their own health to give them more damage and provide more healing. You'd often have to life tap yourself to keep yourself alive or something like that, and they can also convert health to mana. But what they also get is an ability called Blood Feast, which lets the damage that their group does heal them, or the 10% of the damage that the group does will heal the Blood Mage that's in the group, just automatically, just by having that ability toggled on. Which it's a really awesome approach to the class. They can pact their blood with that of the tank or anybody to make them take less damage. It basically makes them share damage with the tank, so they can take part of the damage so the tank doesn't get hit as hard, and then the group will heal the Blood Mage through Blood Feast. It's really an awesome ability toolbox that the Blood Mage has, and it's a very unique style of play. It takes a little bit of getting used to, just because nobody else does it, so it's not something you go into if you've never seen it or done it before knowing what to do. It really takes some work and some practice to get the hang of it, but it's a great class. I love the Blood Mage class. Let's see, in the interest of, I probably took way too long on all those classes, so I'm gonna have to move on here to make this video not too long. But so finally we have the casters. These are the Sorcerer, the Druid, the Psionicist, and the Necromancer. The Sorcerer, I'm sure you can guess, is the straightforward nuker of Vanguard, kind of like a wizard was in EverQuest. They are the standard stand back and drop really big bombs of damage on monsters. They specialize in fire and ice, fire, cold, and arcane is the damage types they really do, and that's really what they're all about. They are the highest parsing class in Vanguard objectively. All other things being equal, the Sorcerer should parse the highest of any of the DPS classes in a situation, unless there's something specifically that gives another class an advantage. They don't really have too much in the way of buffs. They don't really have all that much survivability, as you would guess from being a cloth-wearing flimsy caster in the back, but they can really bring the pain. they're also the best kiting class. So if you're talking about soloing in terms of outdoor kiting mobs around, Sorcerer is probably the best one at that. There are a lot of classes that are good at it. Sorc is probably the best. They can AoE the best from range, and basically that's just what it's everything they're about, is doing damage and from a distance. And they are no questions asked the best about it. They can't really solo, of course, if they're unable to kite, because they can't really take a hit. So if they can't kite, they have trouble soloing, like indoors and places like that. But yeah, they just put out a ton of damage. They're well known for ripping aggro off of tanks and getting themselves killed quickly. It's kind of funny to see it happen. No matter, just doesn't get old. But they're a lot of fun to play. And if you're the kind of person who likes kiting or anything like that, then Sorc is probably your class. Druids are actually the class I probably know the least about. So it'll be interesting when it comes time for me to make my druid video. But unlike a druid in like EverQuest, where a druid was a healer primarily, in this class druids are definitely casters. The druid class does damage, and it actually does pretty good damage still. Not obviously to the level of a Sorc. Sorc is kind of like a rogue for offensive fighters. They're the most focused on doing damage for their offensive fighters or casters. The druid is a little bit more versatile. Obviously, it is still a caster. First of all, it's a caster. It does the class does damage. They get physical nukes. They can root, they can nuke with both arcane and physical. They have some dots. They can snare, kind of like the old druids did. The druid in EQ, they can snare and root and all kinds of things like that. But they're more focused on doing the damage now. They also get cool things called calamities, and phenomena. Which they can use, like earthquake and falling. What's it called? I forget what their big nuke's called now. But basically, they call upon the powers of nature to, like earthquakes and falling comets and stars and stuff, like falling star or whatever. That's the Sorc one, but anyway. And it's just kind of a different style of nuking. But they also, unlike the other casters, they are the caster that has healing abilities. Whereas the druid in EverQuest was a healer with nukes, the druid in Vanguard is a nuker with heals. It's kind of the opposite end of the druid spectrum. So they have some sort of minor heals. They have a group heal over time, kind of rain spell, and they have some minor single target heals they can use to help sort of backup heal or patch heal. You won't find them main healing any groups, just because they're not good enough at healing to do that, but they do kind of have that extra utility which you can use to help with the healing burden, if you will. So they're nice to have for that. And they also have some pretty nice buffs, and they can root, and they have one of the best run speed buffs in the game, and all sorts of stuff like that. They don't quite do as much damage as a sorcerer. However, they probably arguably are one of the best burst damage classes. They're kind of like a monk when it comes to offensive fighters, where their damage is more bursty than it is sustained. That's kind of what a druid is for the caster classes. They can burst really hard especially if they unload all their phenomena points in addition to their energy nukes and stuff like that. And then they kind of have to wait for some of the bigger cooldowns. Not that they do no damage in between, but that's kind of their approach to it. But there will be a lot more information in the druid video, because I'll really get a chance to learn the class by then. I'm sure my description is not very good for the druid, but they're probably the most versatile in terms of healing and buffing, as well as doing damage in terms of the casters. The Psionicist is kind of the enchanter of Vanguard. If you ever played EverQuest, the enchanter was the master of crowd control and mezzing and energy regen and stuff like that. I remember getting clarity from an enchanter in EverQuest, and it's kind of the same thing. Psionicists are the master of psionic energies, the master of crowd control, and sort of, mental stuff like that. Psionicists get the ability to charm and mez. They can't fear like a bard can or a necro can, but they can charm. They have a long-lasting charm which they can use. They can mez, and then at higher levels they can mez multiple monsters at the same time, which is they're the only class that can do that. They get an ability called Simulacrum, which they can create an illusionary clone to sort of distract a monster, which is, it's not a mez per se, but it holds them off the group. It distracts them while the group can deal with something else, or while the Psi can solo something else. And then, in addition to all that, they have some really nice buffs, especially caster buffs for energy regen and intelligence and stuff like that. And they can actually do a very significant amount of damage, which is kind of something that the Enchanter in EverQuest couldn't. The Enchanter was sort of a CC specialist, whereas the Psi gets a bunch of CC and is the CC specialist of Vanguard, but they can really do a lot of damage at the same time. They have more dots than nukes. Most of their stuff is damage over time, as opposed to big nukes like a Sork or a Druid. But if they're geared well and they know how to stack all their dots properly and everything, they can really put out some damage. They also get a stance called Thought Thief, which they can switch into and then cast their nukes again on a mob. So they can dot up a mob and then switch into Thought Thief and recast those same dots, and they'll go up on a mob a second time. Except instead of doing damage, they will return energy to the Psi for the equal to the amount of damage they would have done if the Psi was in Thought Thief stance. So they can actually nuke a mob and get energy back instead of doing damage by using their Thought Thief stance, which is really cool. It's a really cool mechanic and a way for a Psi to never really have to worry about energy if they properly manage their stances and their dot rotations and stuff. It really adds a lot more depth to the class. It's really cool. And then finally the Necromancer. The Necromancer is, at its core pretty standard in terms of the stereotypical Necromancer. They have an army of undead pets they can use. And they are definitely a dot class. Most of their big damage comes from their damage over time, though they do have some nukes. They get Feign Death. In Vanguard, they have an Abomination, which is their main pet, which they can customize, if you will, by getting grafts off of different mobs that they kill as they level up, and then you can sort of graft on body parts onto your Abomination to give it special abilities and make it more powerful as you level. It's a really cool approach to the way to do it. As opposed to just, getting new pets as you level up. They get stronger and then they just are what they are. You can actually customize your Abomination to make it do what it wants, and your Abomination can either buff you, or you can build it into an off tank, or you can build it for DPS so that the pet itself actually does a significant amount of damage, but it can't tank as well. It's different things like that. You can really customize your Abomination to any situation you want by keeping some grafts on hand to swap them in and out. It's really, really cool. But beyond that, they're a big dot class. They can summon up minions in addition to their Abomination, which provide different things. They can do group healing with their minions, sort of in smaller bursts. They can pull up DPS minions instead if they really want to focus on DPS. They can pull up basically all different kinds of things. It's really neat. And then, that's basically it. They're pretty straightforward damage dealer, but they do have some heal abilities via light. They can life tap to themselves, unlike a blood mage who can life tap both themselves and other people. They can't really heal other people for the most part directly through their life taps, but they can heal themselves as much as they want with their life taps. Kind of like a Dread Knight, I guess, if you will. and they also can convert their own health into energy. So it's a really nice balance between their abilities, and the toolbox of the Necro is really nice. And actually, that's a statement that applies to all the classes. Probably haven't done the majority of them any justice in this video, but hopefully that rundown kind of gives people the basic gist of all the individual classes. So if you come in knowing you want to play at the very least knowing you want to play a healer, hopefully I can help you sort of figure out, you know, the style you want to use for healing, and help you pick a class from there. Hopefully something like that. So hopefully this was informative and not too random or disjointed for everybody. I will be doing individual videos for every class, which will go into far greater detail for those classes, and they will have gameplay in them. So if you really want to learn more about a class, you know, keep an eye out, check back for when I put up the video for that class, and hopefully I'll be able to tell you a lot more, because I'll be able to spend a lot more time on each class. The Dread Knight one is already up. I put that one up first. Hopefully the ones I do in the future will be a little more organized and informative. But yeah, keep an eye out for the class videos as I put them out. I have 14 more to do, and hopefully I was able to help everybody out, at least in general, with this video, for anybody who was curious about Vanguard and its classes. So thank you for watching, and again, keep an eye out for my individual class videos.